Hi, and welcome to Maths class. Today we're going to look at dividing fractions. And one of the things we're going to think about is, why is dividing fractions so tricky? Because if we can answer that question, then that will help us to make less mistakes and to get it right and to understand what we're doing. So first, let's just talk about this part, dividing. What is dividing? Well, when I do 12 divided by 3, I know that if I've got 12 of something, I need to know how many groups of 3 can I make. 1, 2, 3, 4. I've made 4 groups of 3. So that's how I understand division. 12 divided by 3 is saying how many groups of 3 are there in 12. But here's the problem. Quite often in English, we say divide it in half. But this is not fraction division. If I divide something in half, like maybe this, it's meant to be an apple, I've divided it in half. This actually means 1 divided by 2. Which is, the answer is a half. If I take one thing and I divide it into halves, I've made 2 halves. What about if I say divide it into thirds? That's not fraction division either. If I take a whole piece of pie, a whole pie, and I divide it into 3 pieces, now I've got thirds. So divide it into thirds actually means divide by 3. 1 divided by 3. That's not fraction division either. So this doesn't mean divide it into half. So what does this actually mean? It means how many halves are there in this one apple? 1 divided by a half asks the question, how many halves are there in 1? Oh, well, the answer is 2. There are 2 halves in 1. What about this one? What does 5 divided by a half mean? Well, that means how many halves are there in 5 apples? Let's count them. I'm going to cut every apple in half. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got 10 halves in 5 apples. So 5 divided by a half gives me an answer of 10. 5 divided by a half asks me how many halves are there in 5. So what's the rule? The rule that you might have learnt already, and maybe this is the thing you sometimes forget or don't know when to use, is if I've got divided by a half, I change my divided by to times, and I turn my fraction upside down. We might call that flipping the fraction, but the real word for that is reciprocal. I take the reciprocal of the fraction. It just means I turn my fraction upside down. So 5 divided by a half gives me 5 times 2, which is the right answer. That's 10. And there are 10 halves in 5. But why does it work? If I've got 5 divided by 1/2, I'm counting halves. If I count my apples, I'm counting wholes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But if I'm counting halves, then my pieces are half the size. I've got twice as many pieces as before. I'm now counting 1/2, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, 7 halves, 8 halves, 9 halves, 10 halves. There are 10 pieces because I've doubled my number of pieces by cutting every piece into 2. Each apple is now 2 halves. So 1 apple becomes 2 halves. That's why I have to multiply it by 2. Okay, so now I understand what 5 divided by a half means. What does a half divided by 3 actually mean? This one's a bit trickier. There's 2 different ways of understanding a half divided by 3. Here's my half. One way is what we started with, divided into thirds. Divided by 3 means divide it into thirds. So if I take my half, and I divide it into thirds, what is one of those pieces equal to? It's equal to 1/6. And if I follow my rule, that works. 1/2, change division to times, turn the fraction upside down. Well, 3 is the same as 3 over 1. So if I turn it upside down, I get 1 over 3. Now when I multiply, I go 1 times 1 across the top is 1. 2 times 3 across my denominators is 6, 1/6. So one way of understanding a half divided by 3 is to take my half and cut it into 3 pieces. Another way of understanding 1/2 divided by 3 is how many 3s are there in 1/2. This is kind of tricky to understand. Here's my half an apple. How many 3s is that? None, surely. Well, no, you'd say none when you're in primary school. But now we understand about remainders and fractions. We know that this half is a part of 3. How big a part of 3 is this half? It's 1/6 of 3. Look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 halves in 3. So a half, how many 3s is that? I can actually understand as meaning how many 3s are there in a half? Not even a whole 3, just 1/6 of 3. Therefore, the answer to a half divided by 3 is 1/6. Oh my goodness. Now how are we going to understand this one? What about 3/4 divided by a half? How many halves are there in 3/4? Can we even do that? Let's try. Let's divide this into quarters. Let's shade 3 of them to make 3/4. 1, 2, 3. So how many halves have I got? Here's 1/2. What's this? This is a quarter. That's actually half of a half. So I've got 1.5. Does that work if I look at the rule? 3/4 divided by a half is the same as 3/4 times 2 over 1. 3 times 2 is 6. 4 times 1 is 4. That gives me 3 over 2. 3 over 2 is the same as 1.5. Can't you just teach me the rule? Sure I can. But if all you're doing is memorizing a rule and not trying to understand what's happening, you're going to make mistakes. So it's really important always to stop and think about what does the question you're being asked mean. But the rule is we change the division to times, and we flip the second fraction. And this is what it looks like if I go back to the question I started with. 3/4 divided by 1/2. The division changes to times, and I flip the second fraction. Now I just do multiplication, which we already know how to do. 3 times 2 is 6, 4 times 1 is 4. That gives me 3/2. So that's how we divide fractions. This has not been a lesson on how to do it. This has been a lesson on how to understand it.